Have you ever heard a sentence so careless, so dismissive, that it echoes in your mind long after the world has forgotten it? Something spoken casually, almost lazily, yet powerful enough to wound a nation's pride. What if I told you that a single remark from a Chinese military officer, delivered with a half-smile, would spark a quiet fire that changed the destiny of one man and eventually humbled an entire room of uniformed commanders? It began with an insult. Soft, almost whispered. The kind meant to belittle, not provoke. "Filipinos are too small to fight," said not in anger, not in jest, but in a tone dripping with condescension, as if a whole country could be dismissed in one breath, as if courage had a height requirement, as if the world had already agreed long ago that Filipinos were simply less. For days, that sentence swirled across online forums and military chat groups. Some repeated it mockingly, some defended it, others pretended not to care. But the sting was there, undeniable, like a splinter under the skin of every Filipino who heard it. Insults about English skills, poverty, or politics, those they had heard before. But this was different. This touched something deeper, something sacred, the Filipino spirit. And then came the shock. Not a politician, not a celebrity, but a man no one expected to speak, Colonel David Henderson, a retired American Marine respected across NATO circles, a man known for his bluntness, his medals, and his refusal to sugarcoat the truth. When asked about the Chinese officer's remark, he paused, adjusted his glasses, and said, "That man has clearly never stood beside a Filipino soldier." People thought he was being polite, diplomatic. But the months that followed would prove otherwise, because Colonel Henderson himself would soon come face to face with the very transformation he never imagined he needed. A transformation that began far from Manila, far from any military base, and far from the Philippines itself. Back then, before everything shifted, Henderson's life was falling apart quietly. His health had begun to betray him. Persistent chest pains, migraines that seemed to claw at the back of his skull, and a loneliness that followed him even in crowded rooms. Decades of service had left him physically strong but emotionally hollow. He had seen war, loss, betrayal, and the slow erosion of trust that comes from watching good men die for bad decisions. By the time he turned 62, something inside him had dimmed. The world that once made sense to him now felt heavy, chaotic, indifferent. And yet, he still carried himself with the dignity of a soldier. Straight back, steady voice, calm eyes. Only his closest friend, an old Navy medic, saw the truth hidden beneath. "You need a change, Dave," the medic told him one evening. "Your heart is tired." Henderson laughed it off. Men like him didn't seek healing. They endured. They survived. They dismissed their own pain as weakness. But it lingered. It grew. And soon, the migraines turned into fainting spells. The chest pains became unbearable. His doctors in California gave him treatment plans, medications, and reassurances that felt robotic. Japan offered advanced procedures, but came with isolation. Europe offered expertise, but no compassion. And so the man once feared on battlefields found himself drifting between countries, searching for something he didn't yet have the courage to name. Hope. The turning point came unexpectedly through a nurse he met during a conference in Singapore. She was a Filipina from Cavite, soft-spoken, humble, and astonishingly attentive as she monitored his vitals after he nearly collapsed backstage. She held his wrist, whispered a prayer under her breath, and said gently, "Sir, you should come to the Philippines. People there will take care of you." He didn't understand why those simple words struck him. Maybe it was the sincerity in her voice. Maybe it was the warmth he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the way she said, "Take care of you," as if care was a language her people had mastered long before hospitals and uniforms. And so began the journey toward a country he barely knew, a country he once assumed was small, fragile, insignificant, a country he would soon discover was anything but. When Henderson finally admitted to himself that he needed help, it wasn't born from weakness. It was born from exhaustion, an exhaustion so deep it clung to his bones. His doctors in Los Angeles recommended another round of neurological tests. A specialist in Tokyo suggested a procedure that would keep him bedridden for weeks. A clinic in Munich promised results, but spoke to him as if he were a case study, not a human being. Everywhere he went, he felt like an object to be examined, a veteran past his prime, a man whose best years were behind him. His nights became long stretches of silence. He stopped answering calls. Food lost its taste. He stared at his medals one evening and felt nothing. Not pride, not nostalgia, not even sadness. Just emptiness. And for a man who had once commanded hundreds of soldiers, that emptiness felt unbearable. But the worst part was the fear that his illness was not only eating away at his body, but at the last pieces of who he was. A soldier without strength, a leader without direction, a man without a place. And yet, in the middle of that darkness, the memory of the Filipino nurse kept returning to him like a soft light. Her voice, her prayer, the steadiness in her touch. "People there will take care of you." He didn't know why those words lingered, but they did. Long enough for him to take a chance he never thought he would take. Before he could travel, however, things had to get worse. The migraines struck with a violence he had never experienced. One night, he collapsed in his kitchen, waking hours later on the cold floor, disoriented and shaking. When he called emergency services, the paramedics treated him kindly but mechanically. "You live alone?" one asked in a tone that felt more like suspicion than concern. That night, lying in the hospital bed, he stared at the ceiling tiles, each square identical to the next, and he felt an overwhelming ache. No home, no peace, no sense of belonging. He had traveled across the world for answers, but every place felt colder than the last. He tried one last attempt in Australia, seeking a specialist who had treated several military personnel, but the waiting list was months long, and he was told, "There are younger candidates who need priority." Younger, worthier, more promising. It broke something inside him. For the first time in his life, the man who had led Marines through fire felt defeated. Not by bullets, not by enemies, but by the quiet cruelty of indifference. And then, unexpectedly, hope flickered again. It came from a message, simple, polite, almost shy, from the same Filipina nurse. She had heard about his collapse from a colleague. "Sir," she wrote, "I asked my friend, a doctor in Manila, about your case. He said you may find better care here. Not just medical care, human care." Human care. Those words did something to him, something he couldn't explain. Attached to the message was the name of a hospital in Quezon City, a Catholic-run institution known not for luxury, but for compassion. There was also an invitation from a small community in Cavite, offering him a place to stay if he ever visited. "You won't be alone here," the nurse wrote. He sat with that message for hours. Was the Philippines really the answer? Was it possible that a country others dismissed so casually held the very thing he was missing? The thought felt strange, almost unbelievable. He had served beside soldiers from dozens of nations. He had traveled to more countries than he could count. Yet here he was, a decorated colonel, clinging to a message from a woman he barely knew, because her words carried something no doctor, no system, no world power had given him. Warmth. He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and whispered into the quiet room, Maybe this is where I'm meant to go. What he didn't know then, what he couldn't know, was that the journey he was about to take would not only restore his health, it would restore his soul. And it would bring him face to face with the truth behind that cruel remark, and the people who would prove it wrong in a way that would leave him speechless. The moment Henderson stepped off the plane at Ninoy Aquino International Airport, something felt different. He couldn't name it at first. It wasn't the humidity, though he felt it wrap around him like a warm blanket. It wasn't the noise, though the mixed chorus of laughter, jeepney engines, airport announcements, and distant chatter felt strangely alive. No, what struck him was the faces. People smiling at him without reason, people greeting strangers as if they were neighbors, people moving with a gentle urgency, as if life was hard but worth embracing anyway. His chest tightened, not from illness, but from something he hadn't felt in years: curiosity. A young airport attendant noticed him adjusting his luggage awkwardly. Without hesitation, she approached. "Sir, let me help you." No questions, no judgment, no coldness, just kindness. Straightforward and sincere. He wanted to decline, the way he always did in the States or Europe, but something about her tone made refusal feel unnecessary. So he allowed it. And the simple act left him oddly unsettled. His ride to Quezon City took him through narrow streets lit by sari-sari stores, crowded sidewalks, and people who looked tired but hopeful, an expression he could never explain, but instantly recognized. A kind of resilience wrapped in faith. A kind of joy wrapped in hardship. At the hospital, he expected the same sterile formality he had encountered elsewhere. He expected clipped voices and cold hands. Instead, a nurse approached him with a smile that felt almost maternal and said, "Welcome home, sir." Home? The word hit him unexpectedly. How could someone who had never met him speak as if he belonged here? The staff treated him with a level of attention that felt personal. When he apologized for being a burden, the head nurse placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're not a burden. You're a person." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. His doctor, a soft-spoken man in his 40s, explained the treatment plan slowly, patiently, as if Henderson were an old friend rather than a foreign patient. He ended the consultation by saying, "We'll fix this together." Together, another word he had forgotten the meaning of. But the turning point didn't happen in the hospital. It happened one evening when he visited Cavite to meet the small community the nurse had mentioned. They greeted him not with caution, but with open arms. Children ran up to him, calling him Lolo David within minutes. A grandmother handed him a plate of pancit, as if feeding him was her sacred duty. A young man placed a rosary in his hand and whispered, "For strength." He felt something break inside him then, not in pain, but in release. A release of years of silence, of loneliness, of being treated like a fading soldier instead of a living human being. Later that night, sitting under a dim street light, he overheard two neighbors speaking about him. "He looks tired," one said. "But he will heal here," the other replied. "People heal in places with heart." Henderson closed his eyes. He didn't know these people. He didn't understand their lives. And yet he felt seen in a way that decades of military service, recognition, and medals had never made him feel. As the weeks passed, he noticed something else. His symptoms began to ease. The migraines lessened. The chest pains softened. His appetite returned. He laughed. Not loudly, but genuinely, for the first time in years when a little girl insisted he join her in singing a Tagalog lullaby he clearly didn't know. And with every moment, every smile, every small act of care, a realization slowly dawned on him. The Philippines was not a country of small people. It was a country of giants. Giants in spirit, giants in kindness, giants in resilience. He had come here seeking treatment. He had found something far greater, a strength that could not be measured in inches or rank or force, a strength invisible to those who only look at size. What he didn't know was that soon he would find himself in a room with the very officers who once mocked the Filipino spirit, and he would be the one left speechless. As the days stretched into weeks, Henderson found himself absorbed into Filipino life in ways he never expected. What began as a medical journey slowly unfolded into something far more intimate, almost sacred. He still woke early, the habit of a Marine ingrained in him, but now his mornings started differently. Instead of the sharp bark of drill sergeants or the hollow silence of foreign hotel rooms, he woke to the gentle sound of neighbors sweeping their yards, the distant crowing of roosters, and the faint melody of someone playing worship music through a half-open window. He would sit outside the small house the Cavite family lent him and watch the neighborhood slowly come alive. Mothers preparing breakfast, fathers fixing motorbikes, children in neatly pressed uniforms walking to school, waving at him as if he'd lived there his whole life. And every morning, without fail, the grandmother who had first given him pancit would bring him a cup of salabat, placing it in his hands as if it were a tradition older than both of them. "This will help your chest," she would say softly. He would nod, smile, and feel a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the tea. His treatment continued at the hospital, but something unusual began to happen. The doctors noticed how rapidly he was improving, not just physically, but in spirit. Depression that had clung to him for years seemed to loosen. His shoulders relaxed, his voice steadied, his eyes brightened. One afternoon, during a routine checkup, the doctor chuckled and said, "Sir, whatever you're doing outside these walls, keep doing it." But he already knew what the doctor meant. It wasn't medicine alone that was healing him. It was the country itself. The people, the faith, the warmth, the stubborn insistence that he mattered, even as a stranger. He saw this most clearly one Sunday when he joined the community for Mass. He wasn't Catholic. He wasn't even sure what he believed anymore. But he followed them anyway, walking with families through narrow streets, feeling strangely unburdened. Inside the small church, he watched as people bowed their heads with a sincerity he had rarely seen. When they prayed, it wasn't out of obligation or ritual. It came from a place of survival, of gratitude, of hope. Faith here wasn't just a belief. It was oxygen. And then something happened. Something quiet, yet monumental. During the prayers of the faithful, a boy no older than 10 stood up and said clearly, "For our guest, Colonel David, that he become strong again. We pray for him." Henderson felt the breath catch in his chest. The entire congregation responded in unison, "Lord, hear our prayer." He lowered his head, overwhelmed. No country he had ever served in had prayed for him like this. No unit, no hospital, no foreign land had embraced his pain as their own. But here, in a small, crowded church in Cavite, a community that barely knew him offered their hearts without hesitation. He walked out of that church a different man. He found himself joining gatherings, sharing meals, laughing at jokes he barely understood, and learning phrases in Tagalog just to make the kids giggle. He helped repair a broken fence. He visited the market with the grandmother. He even tried karaoke, terribly, embarrassingly, but the laughter that followed healed something old and wounded inside him. One afternoon, while sitting with the young man who had given him the rosary, Henderson admitted, "I came here because I thought this was my last chance. But now, I don't want to leave." The young man smiled gently. "People don't come to the Philippines to escape, sir. They come to find themselves." Those words struck him harder than the migraines ever had. His transformation was no longer a gradual shift. It was a revelation, a lifting of everything he had buried under duty, discipline, and silence. He was no longer the broken man who stumbled through hospitals around the world, searching for meaning. He was David again, the man who could feel, trust, hope. And although he didn't know it yet, the strength he had rediscovered here would soon be tested in a room he never expected to enter. A room filled with the very military officers whose insult had first set this entire journey in motion. The invitation came unexpectedly. An international security forum held in Singapore, bringing together retired officers and analysts from across Asia. Henderson almost declined. His life in the Philippines had brought him peace, and the thought of stepping back into the cold formality of military conferences felt like stepping into an old, abandoned version of himself. But his doctor insisted. "Go," he said with a quiet smile. "Not to prove anything, just to see how far you've come." So he went. He packed lightly, carrying only what he needed, but tucked carefully in his breast pocket was the rosary the young man from Cavite had given him. "For strength," the boy had said. He carried it not as a religious symbol, but as a reminder of the place that had pieced him back together, one small, tender gesture at a time. When he entered the conference hall, he felt the old atmosphere immediately. Polished shoes, stiff uniforms, clipped conversations, men speaking loudly to prove their importance. It was a world he had once navigated effortlessly, but now it felt strangely hollow. During the panel discussion, the topic shifted to Southeast Asia. Tensions, alliances, military capabilities, and then, inevitably, to the Philippines. A Chinese officer with a pristine uniform and a rehearsed smile leaned toward his microphone and repeated the same sentiment that had first spread across the internet months earlier. "Filipinos are too small to fight," he said lightly, as if commenting on the weather. A few chuckles followed, but the room did not react the way it once might have. There was a pause, a long, uneasy pause, as if the air itself was waiting for someone to speak. Henderson felt his fingers brush against the rosary in his pocket. Something inside him rose, not anger, not pride, but a profound certainty born from lived truth. He leaned forward, his voice steady, deeper than before. "With all due respect," he began, "you're talking about people you clearly do not know." The room fell silent. He continued, his tone calm but unshakable. "I have served alongside soldiers from many nations. I've seen strength measured in weapons, height, numbers. But in the Philippines, strength is measured in something far greater." He paused, letting the words settle. "I went there broken," he said quietly. "I expected hospitals. What I found was humanity, compassion, courage that does not shout, but endures. The Filipinos I met, nurses, doctors, families, ordinary people, they carry a kind of strength I've never seen anywhere else, a strength the world underestimates because it cannot be quantified." The Chinese officer shifted uncomfortably. Henderson's voice softened, but the weight of his truth filled the entire room. "If you think Filipinos are too small to fight, then you have not stood beside them when life is hardest. You have not seen how they pray, how they laugh, how they carry one another through storms that would break bigger nations. They don't fight with arrogance, they fight with heart." Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. And then, something remarkable happened. Officers from several countries nodded. A Japanese admiral murmured, "He's right." An Australian commander added, "Their resilience is unmatched." Even the moderator stepped in, saying gently, "Perhaps it's time we reconsider our assumptions." But the moment that struck Henderson the most came from a young Filipino attaché seated quietly in the back of the hall. His eyes glistened, not from pride alone, but from something deeper. The rare experience of hearing his people defended not with statistics, not with politics, but with truth. After the session, several officers approached Henderson to thank him, but the one who approached last, the Filipino, spoke the words that would stay with him forever. "Sir," he said softly, "you didn't just defend us. You made us visible." Henderson felt his throat tighten, because he knew it was true. The world often saw the Philippines through headlines, stereotypes, noise. But he had seen something else, something the world needed to see too. When he returned to Manila, the community in Cavite welcomed him with cheers and embraces as if he had returned from war. The grandmother pressed her hands to his cheeks. The children shouted his name. And for the first time in decades, he felt not like a visitor, not like a soldier, not like a patient, but like he belonged. Standing among them, he whispered the words that had grown in his heart long before he ever admitted them aloud. "The Philippines didn't just heal me," he said. "It remade me." And in that moment, he understood the truth that no insult, no mockery, no careless remark could ever erase. You cannot measure the Filipino spirit by height, rank, or power. You measure it by how deeply it touches the world, one heart at a time.